Hey folks, tonight we slip into the murky shadows of a time when silence was a weapon and darkness your only friend, the brutal, gritty world of medieval assassins. Not the sleek, slow-motion ones from movies, but the real ones. The ones who crept through rotting alleyways and crumbling stone passages, dagger clenched and nerves frayed, changing the fate of kings not with glory, but with blood. Now, before we dive deep into these haunted corridors of history, give this video a like and hit subscribe. But only if you're truly drawn to these late-night, quietly intense stories I share. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what hour your clock reads. I love seeing this odd little community of ours stretching quietly across the globe. Now, dim those lights. Let the low hum of your room be your soundtrack. Take a breath. Tonight, we're walking beside ghosts. Let's clear something up fast. No one in the Middle Ages ever aspired to become an assassin. Nobody woke up saying, "You know what sounds great? Slitting a noble's throat for a handful of coin and sleeping under pig carts to stay hidden." Assassins weren't ambitious. They were survivors. The people who'd already lost the game and were now playing on the edges. They weren't monks from mountaintop temples or secret masters of blades. They were ragged soldiers left behind after a war, thieves with decent grip strength, or peasants too forgotten to show up in tax records. Assassins didn't live in the light. They were what crawled in the cracks. If you owned a cow, a shed, or even a second pair of shoes, you didn't do assassinations. You paid for them. But if your face was known in dungeons, if you could hold your breath for a minute in a sewer pipe, and if you had a look in your eye that said, "I have nothing left," then sooner or later someone would slide a heavy pouch across a tavern table and murmur a name you didn't want to hear. And it was never someone simple. You weren't sent after a drunken merchant or a lazy clerk. It was always a duke with his own militia, or a cardinal who slept behind stone walls and 10 locks. The kind of job where success meant survival, and failure meant your skull on a gate. It paid just enough to make you say yes, never enough to make it worth it. Assassins had no retirement, no family waiting, no badge of honor. You couldn't even hint at your line of work unless you were tired of breathing. You lived in silence, slept in corners, and your best cover story was something boring, like, "I sell carpets," blood-stained ones. So no one became a medieval assassin. They ended up one. They were the afterthoughts of history, dressed in stolen cloaks and carrying dull blades. They weren't remembered, just feared, or forgotten entirely, in ditches and wells. Let's tear down the second myth too. There was no assassin academy. No bald master whispering cryptic lessons under torchlight. You didn't get taught how to poison soup or leap rooftops in moonlight. You learned the hard way, by surviving your own mistakes. Your training? Trial and error. Mostly error. You had no map of the castle, no notes on which nobles traveled with decoys, and no clue where the guards rotated. You figured it out while crawling up ivy-stained walls, praying that the dogs didn't catch your scent. If you were lucky, you had once held a sword. If not, you learned that stabbing isn't complicated, but getting away is a different beast. That took instinct, cold timing, and usually a terrifying amount of dumb luck. There were no scrolls, no guild handbooks, no dramatic initiations. Just a man, a mission, and maybe one last whispered breath before vanishing into fog. No glory. No songs. Just shadows, and maybe enough coin for soup, if you lived long enough to eat it. Poison. A craft forged not in books, but in pain. You didn't study it in a warm apothecary beside crackling fires. You guessed, you hoped, and often you bled. Maybe the mix worked. Maybe your targets slurred their words and blamed the wine. Or maybe you sipped from the wrong goblet, and the next thing you knew, you were face down in the stew. There was no medieval poison helpline. Just wild herbs, risky rumors, and your ability to stomach swamp plants. If fate was feeling generous, and it rarely was, you might have learned a thing or two from a passing mercenary or a half-retired thief. Maybe some old blade for hire whispered how to cross a stone courtyard without your boots betraying you. But training? That was a luxury. Mentorship? A myth. Assassins didn't pass down wisdom. They vanished before the second lesson. Weapons? You didn't stroll around with a jeweled saber or some mystical blade forged in moonlight. No, you had a dagger nicked from a drunk guard's belt, maybe a wire you used once and never cleaned. If it fit beneath your ragged cloak and didn't jingle, it made the cut. So no, you weren't a brooding martial arts master. You were just a dirt-streaked loner with hard hands and an intimate understanding of how to disappear into filth. Skill wasn't taught. It was survived. You got good because the first time you messed up, you barely escaped. The second time you didn't. If you were still alive after your third job, congratulations, you were learning. Fast. And likely bleeding. No diploma, no ceremony. Just bruises, silence, and the growing dread that this was your life now. Alone, armed, and hunted. Why'd you do it? Simple. Coin. That sweet, cold metal. Enough to fill a pouch, rent a room, buy a day of peace. That's what they promised you. What you got instead? Lies. Because when someone hires a killer, they don't want loyalty. They want silence. No contracts. No history. And certainly no witnesses, not even you. They handed over a few silver coins, a down payment, they claimed. The rest would come after the deed. But after was a dangerous word. After they confirmed you didn't mess up. After you didn't leave witnesses. After you didn't live long enough to talk. After you didn't suddenly remember you had morals. So you did the job. You crept through shadows, silenced a baron in his sleep. No elegance. No last words. And when you returned, the client was gone. Or waiting with a blade behind their back. Killing you was cheaper than paying you. And even when you did get the coin, it never covered the cost, not the risk, not the nightmares, not the 3 days you spent in a rotting haystack praying the guards didn't smell you. You got paid just enough to forget the regret, but never enough to escape it. Sometimes the job itself wasn't even real. Just a setup. You were sent to kill a traitor, only to find yourself ambushed by a dozen guards, a scapegoat for someone else's agenda. You'd walked into a trap, your name already etched into the gallows plank. You couldn't complain. What would you do? March into court and sue? Excuse me, Your Honor, I'd like to press charges for attempted assassination fraud. No. You died. Or vanished again. You learned. Slowly. You demanded all payment upfront. Trusted no one. Not even the twitchy scribe who said this job would change your life. It did. Just not the way you hoped. Being an assassin was about broken promises. Yours. Theirs. The world's. So you vanished before they could break you too. Now, let's talk about the gear. Forget what the stories say. You didn't carry a folding crossbow or magical vanishing powder. There were no wrist blades or enchanted cloaks. You had what you could steal or fashion in the dark. Rope. Knife. Maybe a second-hand hood that smelled of fear and rain. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't noble. But it was yours. Just like the risk, the silence, and the growing weight of every name you had to forget. Poison. Yeah, it existed. But don't picture some elegant drip into a royal goblet, followed by a dramatic collapse. In the real Middle Ages, poison was a gamble. It was a chaotic blend of herbs, ground-up rocks, and yes, toad guts. Sometimes it killed instantly. Sometimes it took hours. And sometimes, it just made your victim puke for 2 days straight, then recover, furious, and now deeply suspicious of stew. Now let's talk rope. Useful, sure. You could strangle, climb, or tie something shut. But only if you knew your knots. Because nothing kills the tension like wrestling someone in the dark, muttering to yourself, "Wait, does this go under or over again?" And bows? Deadly. If you had one. If you knew how to use it. If you could somehow sneak it into a castle disguised as, I don't know, a florist. Most assassinations didn't happen from a distance. They were up close. Personal. Fast. And hopefully not messy enough to slip in. No backups, by the way. If your blade broke, bent, or fell down a well, you improvised. Slate tile. Rusty nail. A shoe buckle with attitude. You hid your tools anywhere they'd fit, in boots, hems, even hollow loaves of bread. Because your weapon wasn't just a tool. It was your coworker, your boss, and your only retirement plan. You didn't upgrade your gear between jobs. You didn't tinker or polish. You prayed it didn't snap mid-strike. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't the blade that did the killing. It was you. Alone. Poorly equipped. Expected to perform miracles with a spoon and a whisper. Targets? They weren't random drunkards in back alleys. Nobody hired you to stab Jeff, the sleepy candle maker. You got sent after nobles. Bishops. Military commanders. Sometimes royalty. And they were very good at not dying. First guards. Not one or two. Dozens. Fully armored, well-fed, with eyes trained to spot a twitch. You had to study them. Patrol routes, floorboard creaks, which stairs made Sir Asma wheeze halfway up. Then there were the walls. Castles didn't have porches. They had murder holes, moats full of bitey things, and boiling oil. Yes, oil. Hot, skin-melting oil. And even if you made it in, you still had the staff to deal with. Cooks. Scribes. Stable boys. All one raised eyebrow away from yelling, "Hey! I don't think that's the new herbalist." In the Middle Ages, gossip traveled at light speed, especially when it could save your own neck. And your actual target? Paranoid. For good reason. They were surrounded by suck-ups, schemers, and family members who smiled just a bit too much at dinner. They didn't eat without tasters. They didn't sleep without locks. Some even rotated rooms every night, like a deadly version of musical chairs. And no, a feast wasn't your golden chance. Sure, they'd be drunk. So would you. And between you and the target? 50 guards. 3 dogs. A jester with way too much energy. And a room full of witnesses sloshing beer everywhere. Getting close could take weeks. Pretending to be a servant. Bribing a maid. Living in a barrel. And when the moment came, you had one shot. It had to be clean. Precise. Silent. No slip-ups. No noise. Just gone. Or you became the new castle decoration, swinging from the gate with a sign around your neck that read, "Nice try." Let's be honest. When people imagine a medieval assassin, they picture style. Black hoods, gleaming daggers, a dramatic silhouette on the rooftop. The reality? It was sweat, fear, dirt under your nails, and a knife you hoped wouldn't rust before you used it. In reality, you didn't look like some shadowy figure cloaked in mystery. You looked like a sick goat herder with secrets. Disguises in the Middle Ages weren't tailored cloaks and stealthy armor. They were survival-grade improvisation. You wore whatever you could scavenge. A robe 2 sizes too big. A guard uniform that still smelled like the guy who died in it. Peasant rags that screamed, "Please don't notice me." The goal wasn't to stand out. It was to vanish into the noise. But blending in meant looking like everyone else who hadn't bathed in weeks, limped from old wounds, and twitched from hunger. You didn't look suspicious because of the cloak. You looked suspicious because you kept fidgeting with your belt, trying to hide a dagger wrapped in cheesecloth. And masks? Forget it. The closest thing you had was a scrap of cloth over your face, which made you look less like an assassin and more like someone contagious. It kept people away, sure, but it also made feasts and noble gatherings complicated. If someone asked who you were, you had to think fast. I'm Brother Tobias. I specialize in silent prayer and rooftop maintenance. Believable? Maybe. Desperate? Absolutely. Even if you slipped past the guards, noble households weren't full of idiots. Servants noticed things. Unfamiliar faces. People who didn't know the cat's name or which chamber pot went where. You were one misstep, one wrong look, away from being clubbed with a pewter candlestick. And if your disguise worked? Congratulations. Now you had to stay in character for hours, nodding politely at people you'd been hired to kill. Wigs didn't exist. Makeup was soot and spit. You aged yourself with dirt and squinted a lot, hoping no one got close enough to notice your beard was stuck on with honey. Truth was, your disguise didn't protect you. It bought you maybe 5 minutes of confusion. After that, you had to vanish, or convince everyone you belonged there. And if someone saw through you? Let's just say, no one wants to be caught in the bishop's laundry room, dressed as a nun, holding a sword, especially on a feast day. In the Middle Ages, if you were an assassin, you were on your own. No sidekick with a crossbow. No wise alchemist waiting in a basement lab. No handler slipping you coded scrolls and warm pep talks. You had a dull blade, a stolen cloak, and trust issues that could strangle a mule. There were no guilds, not real ones. If people whispered about a brotherhood of assassins, it was probably after too much ale and not enough sleep. You were more likely to meet a ghost than another assassin who wanted to network. Why the isolation? Because the fewer people who knew you existed, the longer you stayed alive. Every contact was a risk. Every conversation a potential noose. Even your client might not know your real name. And if they did, well, you were already planning your exit. Friendship? a liability. Friends asked questions. Lovers noticed the bruises, the dried blood, the way you never slept without a blade under your pillow. You couldn't settle down. You couldn't afford to. One mistake. One face recognizing you in a crowded market. And suddenly you were sprinting toward the nearest sewer with your life in flames. Even other criminals kept their distance. Thieves had crews. Smugglers had routes. But you? You were the guy who made people vanish. They didn't admire you. They feared you. Or worse, they saw you as a walking curse, the kind of person whose presence could attract an angry mob. No one wanted to share a stew with someone who might get them dragged into a bloodbath. And sympathy? Forget it. You couldn't sit down at a tavern and talk about how hard it was to sleep after silently strangling a bishop in his bed. You couldn't open up. If you did, they'd either think you were dangerous or insane. And in fairness, they'd probably be right. So you kept your secrets, your scars, and your blades close, and your back closer to the wall. At the tavern, you never sat near the hearth. You picked the shadowed corner. Eyes on the door. Always the door. You never drank too much. You never lingered past dawn. No names unless silver hit the table, and even then you made one up. Being an assassin in the Middle Ages wasn't just about killing. It was about disappearing, from every place, every person, every life you could have had. Let's say you took the job. You mapped the route. Bribed the gatekeeper. Dressed like a chimney sweep, practiced your limp. And then, you froze. Maybe the target turned and looked right at you. Maybe they were holding their child. Maybe your hand shook, your fingers betraying you, trembling like a leaf in a storm. Guess what? You're already dead. Because failure didn't mean a bad review or a scolding from your boss. It meant pain. It meant spectacle. It meant your name etched in bone, fire, and iron. Medieval executions weren't subtle. They involved wheels, chains, and devices with names like the sinner's kiss or the bone cracker's delight. Missing the mark meant alerting your mark. The target survived, and they'd shouted from every balcony. You went from a ghost to a headline. Tavern walls would sprout your crude likeness like weeds, alongside the words wanted and dead. And those guards you once slipped past? Now they had your face. Now they were angry. Now they had purpose. But it wasn't always the victim you had to fear. Sometimes, it was your own client. See, a failed assassin isn't a tool. They're a liability. A risk. A mouth. And the first thing your employer might do, hire someone else to silence you. There were no second chances. No oops, slipped up. I'll give it another go tomorrow. You had one moment. One clean chance. And if you missed, the best case scenario was dying fast. Before someone asked who hired you. But failure wasn't just lethal. It was humiliating. Not only had you failed to kill, you failed to vanish, to be flawless. And in this line of work, perfection wasn't a bonus. It was survival. Anything less? Might as well paint a target on your back and start rehearsing your last words. Didn't matter how many contracts you'd fulfilled. You could have succeeded 12 times. No one cared. Because in this trade, you're only as good as your last kill. And if that kill didn't happen, you'd better run. So maybe you pulled it off. The strike was clean. No scream. No alarm. Just one sharp moment. A body crumbled silently to the floor. And someone powerful became someone very dead. Congratulations. Now run. Because being a successful assassin didn't mean sipping wine on a balcony as flames lit the skyline. It meant bolting through alleys, soaked in blood, already hearing the hounds sniffing you out. No victory lap. No celebratory drink. No good job handshake from your client. The moment you struck, your new job wasn't finishing the kill. It was escaping the world that suddenly wanted you dead. Guards locking doors. City gates slamming shut. Your escape horse? On the other side of town. You're bleeding, barely thinking. This is why the exit plan mattered more than the hit. Routes memorized. Disguises ready. Fallback shelters. A boatman who didn't ask questions. Maybe a priest who owed you, maybe a smuggler who didn't care. Because within minutes, the city would clamp down like a bear trap. No one wanted scandal. And scandal meant soldiers with sketches, roadblocks, checkpoints. And a dozen angry men with blades looking for the man described as possibly armed and extremely stabby. And what about your client? Let's say they were planning to pay you. They weren't going to meet you at a cozy tavern with a smile and a handwritten thank you note. They'd probably disappear too. Because an assassin who just completed a job? That's the most dangerous person alive. You knew too much. You'd proven you could get in where no one else could. So even when the job was done, you didn't walk away clean. You walked away with a sack of coin in one hand, and a glowing target on your back. And what did that success earn you? A week of restless sleep in damp barns, bribing drunk ferry captains at midnight, shaving your face with a broken mirror in the dark, and pretending to be Brother Lucian, traveling east with monks who smelled worse than your guilt. Because success didn't mean survival. It meant starting the whole game again. New town, new face, new lies, with even more people watching for you this time. So yes, you made the kill. Congratulations. Now run like hell. If being an assassin in the Middle Ages wasn't already miserable, broke, hunted, sleeping in goat-infested sheds, you also had to endure the delightful superstitions of everyone around you. See, in those days, assassins weren't just feared. They were believed to be cursed. To the average villager, you weren't just a man in a cloak. You were something dark. Something unnatural. They thought you whispered to demons. That you smeared frog guts on your blade beneath the full moon. Because how else could someone slip past guards and vanish into shadow? Logic didn't thrive back then. But superstition? Oh, it flourished. Some claimed assassins could shapeshift. Others believed you were invisible unless sprinkled with holy water. A favorite tale said assassins made pacts with forest spirits and could breathe death through walls. Imagine walking through a quiet village and hearing a mother whisper, "Don't look him in the eye. He might curse the baby." Even your tools were suspicious. Carry a dagger? Must be forged in a cursed forge. Use poison? Clearly black magic. Probably stirred with a severed toe under a blood moon. You'd think fear would work in your favor. But the truth? Fear breeds panic. And panic carries torches. Superstitious mobs don't wait for explanations. They throw rocks. They set fire to doors. They scream things like, "Burn him before he calls the lightning." Your reputation didn't protect you. It made you everyone's first guess. Someone dies choking on a chicken bone? Must have been that shadow man in the alley. A fever takes the baker's child? They say he cursed her with a stare. All it took was a rumor. One whisper. And suddenly, the village bell's ringing, a priest is shouting, and 5 angry farmers are charging at you with pitchforks like they've waited their whole lives for this moment. And heaven help you if they found anything odd on you. Dried herbs, strange coins, a foreign accent. That's all it took for someone to scream, "Witch!" and light the pyre. In a world where people believed monsters wore human faces, being too quiet, too clever, too fast was enough to make you a threat. And threats? In medieval logic, they had to die. Quickly. And preferably while on fire. Ah, poison, the so-called elegant weapon of the assassin. No screaming. No blood. Just a sip, a blink, a stumble. And silence. But reality? Poisoning someone in the Middle Ages was like trying to win a sword fight with tea and sarcasm. First problem, poisons weren't consistent. You didn't have powdered cyanide or a neat little death pill. You had leaves. Mushrooms. You had to gather the ingredients. Crush them. Mix them. Whisper a prayer. Then hope. Your noble target might just vomit, cancel dinner, and hire 5 new bodyguards. Precision? Non-existent. You didn't measure doses in grams. You guessed. Too little and they get a stomachache. Too much and you die before the soup hits the table. You couldn't just waltz in and season the pot with deadly herbs. There were 10 cooks, 3 hounds, and a boy peeling onions who'd rat you out because you didn't know the difference between thyme and parsley. You had to bribe a cook. Or pretend to be one. Or worse, sneak into a kitchen crawling with servants, guards, and angry kitchen dogs. Yes. Dogs. Loyal, loud, and trained to bark at unfamiliar smells. And if your target was a noble? They didn't eat like common folk. They ate like they were preparing for war. Every plate was inspected. Every dish blessed. Every crumb sniffed by someone, the steward, the guard, even the jester if he looked bored. By the time it reached the table, that roast had passed more security than a royal heir. Even if you pulled it off, slipped in the poison, undetected, and the mark actually ate it, what came next was anyone's guess. Some poisons took hours. Others? Days. 1 minute your target's laughing over spiced wine. The next, they're clutching their stomach and demanding to see their astrologer. And if they lived? Guess who they blamed. Not the cook. Not the taster. You, the quiet man in the corner with herbal stains on his sleeves and eyes that never blinked. Poison wasn't clean. It wasn't reliable. It was chaos in a bottle, risky, slow, and never on your side. And if you were caught? Forget a clean execution. They didn't just kill you. They questioned you. Loudly. With fire, steel, and devices with names like the confessor's teeth. You'd admit to everything, poisoning the duke, the dog, the stable boy, just to make it stop. You'd think that after changing the fate of a kingdom, after killing a tyrant or toppling a bloodline, someone might remember your name. But they wouldn't. You were an assassin. And assassins aren't remembered. They're erased. At best, you became a rumor. A shape in a cloak. A quiet traveler who never finished his ale. A ghost with a dagger who stepped into history, and then vanished from it. Even if you pulled off the greatest kill of the century, your legacy was a blank page in a dusty book. And that was the point. Your client didn't want a legend. They wanted silence. Plausible deniability. The fewer who knew, the safer they were, and the less chance they'd end up poisoned by you next. So your name? Gone the moment the job was done. If you even used your real one. You didn't sign your work. You didn't boast. You didn't keep trophies. You existed only in that moment, a shadow behind a locked door, a whisper before dawn. And if someone did know your name? That was a loose end. And in your line of work, loose ends had short lifespans. As for honor? There were no medals for the silent. No statues for the man who stopped a war with one blade in the night. If anyone got a monument, it was the noble who ordered it. You got a pine box. An unmarked grave. If you were lucky. If not, your head went on a spike labeled, traitor, for crimes no one could prove, except the ones you committed. Sometimes your name lived on, but only in curses. You became a warning. Don't betray the crown. Remember what happened to Lord Ulrich. But no one ever remembered you. The man who made it happen? Gone like smoke. That was your legacy, not glory. Not fear. Just absence. You weren't meant to leave a mark. You were meant to vanish. If you stayed long enough to be recognized, you stayed too long. Because in the medieval world, heroes were remembered. Assassins were removed. So let's say you survived. You completed the job. You even got paid, a miracle on its own. Now what? Lay low. Stay quiet. Hope your client keeps their word and protects your identity. Right. Wrong. In the world of blades and whispers, there was one rule more sacred than: don't get caught. Trust no one. Especially the one who gave you the coin. Your client, noble, merchant, bishop, didn't hire you because they admired your skill. They hired you because they needed something terrible done, but once the job was finished, you knew who wanted who dead. You knew why. You knew when, where, and for how much. And that made you dangerous, not just to their enemies, but to them. So what did they do when the job was finished? They vanished. Cut ties. Pretended you never existed. Or worse, they sent someone else after you. Not to thank you. To erase you. To tie off the contract with something sharper than ink. Some clients even double-booked, hiring one assassin to finish the target, and a second to clean up the first. No refunds. Just reduced risk. And if you ever dared to blackmail them? If you even hinted that you might reveal their name? That wasn't brave. That was your last mistake. Because powerful people in the Middle Ages didn't negotiate with threats. They eliminated them. If your client had a shred of honor, rare as dragon bones, you might get paid. You might be left alone. But even then, you knew they were watching. From a distance. Was someone sharpening steel and memorizing your walk? Because you weren't a hero. You weren't even a person. You were a secret. And secrets don't speak. They vanish. Even success couldn't buy you trust. Because if you'd killed once, you could kill again. And no one, not even the one who paid you, wanted to be next. Now let's pretend you beat the odds. You survived the poisonings, the lies, the betrayals. You outlived your enemies, your clients, maybe even your own conscience. Now what? Do you retire? Of course not. There was no retirement for someone like you. No pension. No quiet cottage by the sea. No peaceful strolls through vineyards with a loyal hound and a glass of wine. No. You didn't retire, you disappeared. Or you died. Sometimes both. Because even if you walked away, your past followed. You knew too many names. You'd seen too many faces. You carried too much blood on your hands, and in your memories. People didn't want you living quietly in the countryside. They wanted you forgotten. Which, more often than not, meant buried. And even if no one came for you, a miracle in itself, you lived every day assuming someone might. Maybe a younger assassin. Someone eager to prove himself. Given a name. Given your name. So you changed identities again. You moved to a village where questions were few and strangers were invisible. You faked a limp. You sold herbs. You told people you used to work as a guard. But even then, you didn't sleep deeply. You avoided crowds. You always sat facing the door. Your dagger? Hidden under the floorboard, next to a pouch of coins you never spent. Because they still smelled like the man you took them from. And over time, you stopped trusting yourself. Years of shadows, blood, and silence warped something in your brain. Every knock at the door made you flinch. Every stranger on the road was a potential memory waiting to recognize you. You stopped dreaming. Dreams were dangerous. You couldn't love. Couldn't laugh too loud. Couldn't relax. You lived like a ghost, pretending to be a man. Because the truth? There was no ending for people like you. Just a slow, cold fade into obscurity. Always moving. Always watching. Until one night you slipped into the dark, and no one noticed. And maybe that was the best you could hope for. By now, you've probably figured it out. Being a medieval assassin? It wasn't romantic. It wasn't noble. It wasn't even all that profitable. It was dirty. It was miserable. And it was short. It was a life wrapped in blood-stained linen, followed by shadows and people who all wanted you dead. You wouldn't last. Not a week. Maybe not even a day. Because you'd start with the wrong idea. That you'd be sleek, controlled, mysterious, a whisper in the dark. But what you'd actually be? Cold. Hungry. Exhausted. And one bad guess away from the rope. You'd creep into town with your cloak pulled tight, ready for the perfect strike, only to find out your target left yesterday. The guards are drunk, but eager for a fight. And the stable boy you bribed for intel? He just sold you out, for a pint of ale and half a crust of bread. You'd falter at the worst moment. Strike the wrong man. Be seen by the stable boy who once glimpsed your silhouette by the abbey. And just like that, you're no longer the invisible blade, you're the loose thread in the tapestry. So what then? You flee. But this isn't a chase through sleek city streets. It's a medieval maze, slippery mud, crooked cobblestones, and an outrageous number of panicking geese underfoot. You skid, crash, and are slammed into the ground by a guard named Thomas, whose fiancée just ran off with the town apothecary. And suppose, against all odds, you survive. Now comes the reckoning. No comrades. No code. No future. Just suspicious stares, alleyway whispers, and the sickening truth that even if you pulled off the job, the best retirement you can hope for is to die nameless and unnoticed in a moss-covered cottage where people still believe in wood spirits. So no, you wouldn't last. And honestly, you were never meant to. Because being an assassin wasn't stylish or daring. It was a pitiless system that swallowed people whole and spit out hollow echoes. It gave you control without clarity, missions without meaning. You didn't etch your name into history. You erased your existence from it. And when the end came, it was quiet. A silence no one questioned, because no one remembered you'd ever existed. Long before she was feared as the Queen of Macedonia, Olympias was known by another name, Myrtle, a Meletian princess raised among the windswept peaks of Epirus. Her lineage, her people swore, traced back to Achilles himself. Whether myth or blood memory, one thing was true: this was no woman born to sit quietly in the margins. From her earliest days, Myrtle's world pulsed with enigma and ceremony. Her childhood was steeped in more than courtly manners. It was woven with visions, rituals, and the murmurs of gods older than time. She was no placid noblewoman threading silks by firelight. She gravitated toward serpents, symbols, and the intoxicating rites of Dionysus. There, barefoot beneath the stars, she danced in trance with priestesses who howled to the divine. Her faith wasn't a mask. It was marrow. She didn't worship, she embodied. According to writings penned by men equal parts awestruck and afraid, she kept sacred snakes in her chambers, let them twist beside her in sleep. Was this literal? Or just the usual venom spat at powerful women? Hard to say. But it stuck. To her followers, it proved her touched by gods. To her enemies, it made her untouchable in the worst way. Her power didn't bloom on battlefields. It coiled in candlelit corners, among whispered invocations and serpentine grace. She wasn't merely royal, she was a vessel. A living, breathing oracle. Not shaped by politics but by the deep, cold truths of older powers. So when Philip II of Macedon, ruthless, brilliant, and famously insatiable, landed on the mystical Isle of Samothrace for religious rites, he didn't encounter just a beautiful noblewoman. He found a riddle carved in flesh. Their union wasn't just convenient, it was cosmic. A fusion of ambition and augury. And the moment they joined, the world seemed to notice. Some swore the heavens split with lightning that night. Others whispered that Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt entering her womb. Legends, all of them. But one truth endured: from their bond came not just a child, but a force of nature. Alexander. And from the instant of his first breath, Olympias was determined: this son was not born to follow fate. He would command it. Her marriage to Philip wasn't a crown and roses romance. It was the collision that shook an empire into existence. From the beginning, their union was a volatile cocktail of prophecy, pride, and paranoia. Philip, brilliant, brutal, and already collecting wives like war trophies, married Olympias around 357 BC. She was young, likely still a teenager, but far from naive. She saw in Philip a partner whose hunger for power mirrored her own, and perhaps even a man cast by fate to match her divine ambitions. Macedon was no gentle kingdom. It was a land forged in iron, where kings fell to cousins and brothers turned rivals with a single toast. But Olympias, priestess of papaya and daughter of fire and ritual, walked into that world head high, already eyeing the throne. Their marriage was turbulent from the start. Philip, for all his tactical genius, had no patience for monogamy. He married often, for treaties, for territory, for power. But Olympias was no silent queen waiting in the wings. She ruled her own circle, built her own alliances, and leaned heavily on omens and oracles, not just to read the future, but to shape it. Then came the birth of Alexander. And with him, a storm of myth. They say Olympias dreamed of lightning striking her womb, of fire swirling around her newborn without leaving a burn. Philip, too, had a vision, a lion sealing his wife's womb shut. A literal lion. Whether they believed these visions or invented them hardly mattered. They acted as if destiny had just taken human form, and it bore the name Alexander. But even as the child was wrapped in wonder, the marriage frayed further. Olympias grew to loathe Philip's other wives. Especially one, Cleopatra Eurydice, a young Macedonian bride married late in Philip's life. This wasn't mere jealousy. It was threat assessment. Cleopatra was Macedonian by blood. Any son she bore would be considered pure by the native nobility. A direct threat to Alexander's future claim. Olympias saw it clearly: the palace wasn't home. It was a battlefield. And she would wield every whisper, every snake, every sacred rite she knew to ensure her son didn't just survive. He reigned. Gone was the girl named Myrtale. She was Olympias now, a queen forged in prophecy and vengeance. And no one would take Alexander's crown without first facing her fury. By the time Alexander entered his teenage years, the royal palace and Pella had turned into a silent war zone. Veiled insults dripped like poison. Alliances shifted like sand. And every glance held the weight of betrayal. Olympias wasn't just defending influence. She was fighting for existence. She knew the court was full of snakes. But she was the one who taught them how to coil and strike. Philip, meanwhile, began drifting. More campaigns. More wine. And worse still, more attention paid to his Macedonian counselors and their ambitions. Then came the final fracture. Philip married again. A noble girl named Cleopatra Eurydice, not to be confused with that Cleopatra of Egypt. This one was local. And her uncle? Attalus, one of Philip's most trusted generals. To Olympias, it wasn't just betrayal. It was an open declaration of war. The wedding was a disaster, but not in the way songs are written about. During the celebration, A drunken Attalus raised a cup and slurred a cruel joke, taunting Olympias and Alexander, casting doubt on the boy's lineage. Was he truly Philip's son, or, as Olympias liked to claim, was he born of gods? The insult was barbed, but Olympias turned it into armor. Let them gossip. Let them believe her son was Zeus-touched. Myths were more powerful than facts. Alexander, furious, stormed out of the feast. Olympias didn't just leave the party, she left the kingdom. She returned to Epirus, her homeland. But her withdrawal was not a retreat. It was repositioning. In Epirus, she was still revered. She had her network, her allies, her influence. And from that distance, she watched Philip's court begin to crumble. She didn't need a throne to be a threat. Then came the tremor that split the palace. Philip assassinated, cut down at his daughter's wedding just before launching his grand invasion of Persia. Just before he would have crowned himself not only king but emperor of half the world. And across the marble columns and echoing halls of Macedon, the same question whispered through clenched teeth: who orchestrated it? Was it Pausanias, the wrong bodyguard who wielded the knife? Was it palace politics? Was it Alexander seeking the crown? Or dare they say it, was it Olympias? No proof. No confessions. But many believed. And then, like smoke from a ritual fire, the real purge began. Within days, Philip's new wife Cleopatra Eurydice and her newborn child were dead. Murdered, the rumor said, by Olympias herself. The serpent had slithered back into the royal chambers. And now, nothing blocked her son from the throne. While the court reeled in confusion and mourning, Olympias struck. Not with hesitation, but with precision. First, she eliminated Cleopatra Eurydice, the young rival queen. And it wasn't just death, it was a message. A theatrical, brutal reminder of who held the dagger. Some accounts claimed Cleopatra was forced to take her own life after witnessing the murder of her child. Others say the infant was burned alive on a pyre. What they all agree on, Olympias showed no mercy. She had learned what other queens refused to admit: mercy in a palace is weakness. A child, no matter how innocent, is a future claimant. And Olympias was finished playing the game by other people's rules. With Cleopatra's bloodline wiped out, her focus returned to Alexander. Her son, still a teenager but already a philosopher warrior trained by Aristotle, was declared king without real opposition. But don't let the smooth transition fool you. It wasn't destiny alone that secured his crown. It was Olympias. She didn't simply protect his rise, she choreographed it. She threatened generals, seduced allies, and removed enemies with the cold efficiency of a tactician. Alexander, for his part, reportedly disapproved of how Cleopatra's family met their end. But he didn't stop it. Because in some hidden part of his heart, he knew what his mother had always known: in Macedon, power demands blood, and bloodlines are double-edged swords. With her son crowned, Olympias stepped back, but only outwardly. She faded from the battlefield and the council hall, retreating into the shadows. But she wasn't idle. She became the high priestess of his empire, the guardian of his fate. As Alexander prepared to conquer Persia, she stayed behind. Not as a retired queen, she sent him relics, consulted the stars, communed with oracles, and whispered to the gods on his behalf. To Olympias, this wasn't war. It was destiny unfolding. Alexander wasn't marching to fight, he was marching to fulfill divine prophecy. And as long as she drew breath, no rival, Macedonian, Persian, or divine, would stop him. She had sculpted his rise, cleansed the bloodlines, ensured the crown. Now, from behind the veil, Olympias would guard her son's empire. Not with hands clasped in prayer, but with fangs bared in silence. As Alexander marched east to conquer the known world, Olympias remained in Macedon. A queen without a throne, but far from powerless. Her official title was Queen Mother. But make no mistake, she ruled, even if the crown sat on someone else's head. Technically, regency fell to Antipater, one of Alexander's most trusted generals. But Olympias had no intention of being pushed to the side. She flooded her son with letters, not tender notes from a mother, but sharp political dispatches threaded with prophecy and poison. She advised. She warned. She scolded. These were not the writings of a doting parent. They were commands laced with visions, omens, and veiled threats. And Alexander, thousands of miles away, read every single word. She reminded him who his enemies were. She questioned his companions. She criticized his fascination with Persian customs, his choice of wives, and his dangerous flirtation with divinity. No one else would dare say these things. But Olympias was no ordinary mother. She spoke as both matriarch and oracle. And Alexander listened. Back home, Antipater grew weary and bitter. Olympias undermined him at every turn, weaponizing her royal status, her religious authority, and her bloodline. She stirred unrest in Epirus, in Thessaly, and among the Macedonian nobility. Her whispers were sharp. And when Olympias whispered, people listened. Sometimes they died. Her letters to Alexander became more urgent, painting Antipater as a second Philip. A man with ambition enough to betray, and a will to rule in Alexander's absence. Whether she truly believed it or simply feared fading into irrelevance, she pushed her son to act. But Alexander hesitated. He needed Antipater to maintain order in Greece while he expanded east. And so, the rift between mother and general grew. Olympias watched. She waited. But beneath her sacred robes and maternal concern, her patience thinned. She hadn't fought through years of palace intrigue, just to bow to an aging soldier. As Alexander's empire stretched from the Aegean to the edge of India, Olympias saw the cracks forming. He trusted too many foreign advisers. He drifted from the gods, and from the mother who had made him. She believed his triumphs came from divine favor, and from her. And if he ever forgot that, Olympias knew exactly how to remind a king of where he came from, even if that king was her son. Then, in 323 BC, the world shattered. News arrived from Babylon. Not like a trumpet, but like a dagger. Alexander was dead. For Olympias, it wasn't just the loss of a child. It was the collapse of everything she had built and bled to protect. Her son, the divine storm she had birthed, guided, unleashed, was gone. And worse, he left no clear heir. No chosen successor. Only chaos. The mighty empire he carved was already beginning to crack. His generals, once loyal, were now circling, carving it up like wild dogs over a lion's corpse. And in Macedon, Antipater still held power. He had never loved Olympias, and he wasn't about to start now. Her daughter Cleopatra, Alexander's sister, was being courted by those same generals, each one wanting to marry her and use her royal bloodline as a claim to the throne. Olympias saw what was coming. Not a civil war. A storm. And she knew how to read storms. Once again, she would have to act. But this time, there was no Alexander. What she had instead was his legacy. His bloodline. Alexander IV, the young son born to Roxana, the Bactrian princess Alexander had wed. Roxana was still in Macedon. And she was vulnerable. The child even more so. And Olympias? She still had one weapon left. Olympias understood one chilling truth. The child was now the last living ember of her son's legacy. That made him a target, but also a symbol, a weapon, and a claim. She joined forces with Roxana and the boy, vowing to protect them both. Not out of sentiment, but strategy. The boy's blood gave her leverage in the great game of survival now erupting across Alexander's fractured empire. But the winds had shifted. The generals who once knelt to her son now hungered for crowns of their own. They had soldiers, grudges, and ambitions, none of which included obeying a grieving mother or a foreign widow. Olympias was undeterred. She had faced venom, betrayal, and emperors. A few opportunistic warlords meant nothing. So she watched. Waited. Calculated. When Antipater died and his throne passed to his ruthless son Cassander, a man colder than winter marble, Olympias knew the collision was inevitable. The old queen and the cold-eyed usurper were destined to clash. Alexander's body had long turned to dust, but his shadow still stretched across the land. And inside that shadow, Olympias still waited, coiled, alert, lethal. Years passed. Alexander's empire crumbled under the weight of its own greatness. Civil war shattered loyalties. And then Olympias made her boldest move yet. She returned to Macedon, not as a mourning mother, but as a sovereign force of divine rage. The regency had fractured. Cassander was clawing his way to dominance. Roxana and young Alexander IV were prisoners in all but name. Olympias read the signs. If she did not move now, her grandson would be erased from history. She struck a deal with Polyperchon, an aging general with just enough legitimacy left to matter. Olympias would not return to plead for justice, she would return to demand rule. Backed by Polyperchon's troops, she crossed into Macedon. The moment her feet touched its soil, the kingdom trembled. Towns opened their gates without resistance. Soldiers deserted to her cause. Even her enemies faltered. Her name still had weight, ancient, heavy, thunderous. Then came vengeance. Like a storm sweeping the plains, she hunted down Cassander's loyalists. When she finally caught Philip III Aridaeus, Alexander's half-brother, a simple-minded puppet king, she gave the order for execution. His wife Eurydice, captured alongside him, was offered the chance to end her own life. When she refused, Olympias had her strangled. It wasn't just a purge. It was a performance. Olympias styled it as divine justice, a theatrical bloodletting cloaked in ceremonial wrath. She wanted the world to see. Only those with Alexander's blood had a right to sit on the throne. All others were impostors. For a flickering moment it worked. The kingdom bowed again. She had restored the Argead line, silenced traitors, and made all of Macedon remember what it meant when a woman ruled with nothing left to fear. But Macedonian power is as fleeting as flame on dry straw. And Cassander was not defeated. He waited, regrouped, and returned, stronger, colder, more brutal than ever. His forces dwarfed hers. His coffers were full. His vengeance glacial. One by one, Olympias's allies fled. Polyperchon's influence crumbled. And now she stood alone in the stone fortress of Pydna, the last embers of her resistance flickering behind its walls. She had set the blaze that scorched Macedon. But now the smoke was thick, the sky dim, and her enemies were marching at the gates. Olympias, once the most feared woman in the ancient world, now stood besieged in the coastal fortress of Pydna. Alone. Cut off. Surrounded by the army of Cassander, the son of her old enemy, come to finish what his father had begun. But Olympias did not weep. She did not plead. For nearly a year, she endured the siege like a statue carved from divine vengeance. Food dwindled. Disease crept in through the cracks. Allies vanished. Yet inside those crumbling walls, she remained unyielding. The same iron presence that had once made kings tremble. To the bitter end, she bore herself not as a prisoner, but as the mother of a god. Cassander hesitated. He was ruthless, but not foolish. Even now, Olympias carried myth-like armor. She was still the mother of Alexander the Great. To spill her blood outright might smell of sacrilege. So he offered terms. Surrender, and he'd spare her life. But Olympias had seen too many royal promises dissolve into betrayal. She knew the cost of trust. Still, starvation is its own kind of siege. It breaks bodies long before it bends wills. Her soldiers cracked. Her garrison surrendered. And Olympias, who had stood like a thundercloud for decades, was finally delivered into the hands of her enemies. Cassander didn't soil his hands with her blood. That would be too clean. Too kind. Instead, he turned her over to the families of those she had executed during her brief resurgence. Let them choose her fate. They condemned her to death. But when the time came, when the blades were drawn, no one stepped forward. Olympias stood tall, silent, unshaken. Her eyes didn't plead. They burned. These were Macedonians. They had once cheered her son as a living god. They had heard the stories of her snakes, her visions, her sacred rites. Now here she was, aged, fragile, yet cloaked in legend. And not a single man dared raise the sword. So Cassander summoned outsiders. Foreigners. Men with no memory of her glory, only orders to obey. And so Olympias was struck down. Not with ceremony. Not with honor. But with silence. Her death marked the extinguishing of Alexander's bloodline and power. The last ember of an empire kindled by divine ambition, snuffed out. But even in death she cast a shadow. History would not forget the Serpent Queen. Olympias did not die on a throne. She died in the dirt, unarmed, abandoned, executed by those who once bowed before her. Yet history is a strange creature. It doesn't always remember those who died wrapped in silk. Sometimes it remembers those who went down hissing. And Olympias was never meant for quiet history. In life, she wielded motherhood like a blade, and prophecy like a shield. She was not merely the mother of Alexander the Great. She was an architect of his myth. Without her, there is no divine storm. No dreams of thunderbolts or lions sealing wombs. No purging of rivals to clear the path for a boy king to conquer the world. Olympias did not just give birth to an empire. She defended it with claws. And even among history's most ruthless women, she stands apart. She didn't lead armies like Cleopatra. She didn't charge into battle like Boudica. Her war was subtler, colder. A war of poisoned cups, arranged marriages, sacred fires, and whispered threats. She mastered fear. But more importantly, she mastered belief. She made the world believe her son was divine. And perhaps she believed it herself. Her enemies called her many things. A murderer. A witch. A manipulator. And they weren't wrong. She was all those things, and more. Olympias was born into a world where cunning was currency. And kindness was a liability. She learned early that mercy was a luxury queens could not afford. In the centuries after her death, Olympias was split between myth and memory. To some, she was a tyrant, a manipulator cloaked in ritual and rage. To others, she was a mother, a prophetess, a visionary who refused to fade into the shadow of men. But regardless of where one stands, no historian, ancient or modern, could ever claim she was forgettable. She lingered like smoke behind the throne of Alexander, never center stage, but never far from it. And maybe that was always her purpose. Not as a grieving footnote in a king's story, but as a story of her own. A woman woven in prophecy, who kept sacred serpents in her chambers, who defied kings and gods alike. Olympias may have returned to dust, but her legend breathes in every tale of fearsome queens, in every whisper of inherited power, in every empire fueled by myth. She is still there, in the dark, watching, waiting. Far from the intrigues of Macedon, on the sun-scoured island of Crete, lies a place that feels more conjured than constructed. Just south of modern Heraklion, the ruins of a palace slumber, twisting stone corridors that double back, staircases that descend to nowhere, chambers that spiral endlessly. It confuses even modern visitors. This place is Knossos, the jewel of Minoan civilization, and perhaps the true birthplace of one of history's most enduring legends, the labyrinth of the Minotaur. But before the myth, there was stone. And before the monster, there was a masterpiece. Built around 1900 BC and expanded for generations, Knossos was no ordinary palace. It was a city hidden beneath a single roof. Stretching over 150,000 square feet, it housed more than 1,000 rooms, sacred shrines, grand halls, storehouses, workshops, even plumbing that some believe includes the world's first flushing toilets. With multi-level architecture, fresh water systems, and ventilation designs ahead of their time, this was no fortress of brute stone. It was a marvel of elegance and engineering. To modern eyes, it seems chaotic. To the ancients, it likely felt enchanted. The man who uncovered it was British archaeologist Arthur Evans. In the early 20th century, Evans led the excavation and became convinced that he had found the root of the Greek labyrinth myth. The palace's complexity was bewildering. Its architecture seemed symbolic, even ritualistic. And everywhere, on frescoes, reliefs, jewelry, he found bulls. Painted, carved, gilded. The bull, sacred to the Minoans, stood at the center of their art and worship. Evans went so far as to name the entire civilization after the legendary King Minos. Whether Minos himself ever lived is uncertain. But his name fused with the ruins, and the story stuck. Yet there's a twist. No actual labyrinth has ever been found. No underground maze. No chains. No monster with a man's body and a bull's head. Instead, what remains is something subtler, stranger, a city that coils inwards, built to disorient. A place where architecture and legend blur until you can no longer tell where the truth ends and the myth begins. So perhaps the real question isn't whether the Minotaur was born inside the labyrinth, but whether the labyrinth itself was the beast. Knossos doesn't surrender answers easily, but it excels at making us ask the right questions. The story we inherit is as much myth as ruin, a monstrous half-man, half-bull kept in a maze so intricate no soul who entered could find their way back out. Only Theseus, the Athenian prince, escaped, thanks to the cunning of Princess Ariadne and a simple ball of thread. But where did the tale begin? Why a maze? Why a monster? The earliest versions speak of King Minos, a ruler so powerful that even the sea gods obeyed him. To punish Athens, he demanded a cruel tribute, 7 boys and 7 girls, every year, to be fed to the beast beneath his palace. The Minotaur, a creature born from divine wrath and human shame, waited in the shadows of stone for his next meal. The Minotaur, trapped in a twisting maze beneath the earth, was more than a beast. He was a symbol of the savage truth buried beneath splendor. To the ancient Greeks, Crete was a land both mesmerizing and unsettling. A kingdom of sea and stone, wealth and ritual. Its people, the Minoans, were elegant and alien. Their rites included leaping over bulls. Their gods were strange and fluid. Their palaces, sprawling, labyrinthine, bore no resemblance to anything found on the mainland. To a Greek visitor in 1000 BC, Knossos must have felt like another world entirely. The bull, in Minoan belief, was sacred. In fresco after fresco, young men and women vault through the air above charging bulls in ritual dance. Huge stylized bull horns, called horns of consecration, crowned rooftops and sanctuaries. And the palace itself? It wasn't a fortress. It was a maze. Here, legend begins to take shape. But what if the Minotaur wasn't just a monster? What if he was a metaphor? Some scholars believe the myth reflects an older memory of Minoan dominance over Athens. A time when the city did, perhaps, pay tribute to a more powerful and mysterious empire. In this view, the labyrinth becomes political. A trap of influence, impossible to navigate. The Minotaur, the raw, terrifying embodiment of Crete's power. Others read it more inwardly. The labyrinth as the mind. The Minotaur, our most primal urges. And Theseus? The hero who enters the unknown, guided only by the thread of memory, fragile, but essential. Still, the myth remains tangled in the ruins of Knossos. We've found no monster. No Ariadne. But what we have found is perhaps more powerful. A real place, wrapped in echoes of myth. Or a myth, birthed from something real. Long before Athens built its marble temples. Before Sparta's spears gleamed in the sun. There was the Minoan civilization. One of Europe's earliest great cultures. They ruled not with swords, but with ships, with saffron, with art. Their cities rose on Crete, beginning around 2600 BCE, and flourished for centuries. At the center of it all stood Knossos. Not just a palace, but a living engine of trade, ceremony, and governance. The Minoans built relationships where others built empires. Their ships crossed the Aegean and beyond. To Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, even to the Iberian coast. They traded pottery, bronze, perfume, and precious spices. They were diplomats of the sea. What's most striking about their legacy is how different it feels. Where later Greek art would Leonize war and vengeance, Minoan art celebrated the living world. They painted dolphins, lilies, and dancers. Their walls showed athletes soaring over bulls, not killing them. Their goddesses, powerful and bare-breasted, held serpents, symbols of fertility, transformation, protection. Not thunderbolts or swords. And at the heart of it all, Knossos. Not a fortress perched on cliffs, but a vast, airy complex nestled in a fertile valley. There were no giant walls, no iron gates, no looming defenses. That alone speaks volumes. Either they felt safe, or they had projected such strength that no one dared challenge them. Their confidence was carved into architecture. Multi-storied halls, columned courtyards, intricate staircases. Even an advanced plumbing system centuries ahead of its time. And yet, for all their brilliance, the Minoans left behind no readable voice. Their main script, known as Linear A, has never been deciphered. Their words remain locked behind symbols. Silent watchers of a world long gone. We don't know what the people of this ancient world called themselves. Their own words have vanished like smoke. We don't know what their kings believed, what gods they whispered to in the dark, or what rituals played out behind the walls of Knossos. What we do have, what remains, is their legacy in stone and pigment, ruins, art, echoes. Echoes that were later absorbed by the Mycenaeans and carried forward into Greek myth. The Minoans weren't merely palace builders. They were curators of wonder. Knossos was never just a structure. It was the living heart of a civilization that glittered like sun on the Aegean before it sank beneath the tides of time. But some say its soul never left. Some say, if you listen closely, you can still hear its breath in the stone. To walk through Knossos is to step into a dream layered in centuries. It's not just the vastness that stuns you, it's the way the space behaves. Rooms melt into other rooms. Corridors fracture, double back, or vanish entirely. Light wells split open the heart of the structure, while staircases twist up into the sun or disappear down into silent shadow. Direction is illusion. Logic folds in on itself. No wonder the ancients whispered of a labyrinth. Knossos wasn't a palace. It was alive. Spanning over 150,000 square feet, the complex held more than 1,000 rooms. Some no larger than closets. Others grand halls. But they weren't chaotic. Every chamber had a purpose: workshops, granaries, altars, apartments, throne rooms. All centered around a large courtyard, possibly a stage for public rituals, maybe even the famed bull-leaping ceremonies. The palace was layered 3, 4, sometimes 5 stories tall, rising with the land or built into artificial terraces. To move through it without losing your way required memory, instinct, or perhaps a thread, like Theseus. But beneath this disorienting design lay genius. The Minoans mastered passive cooling using shafts and stairwells to circulate air. They directed rainwater through clay piping. They had toilets that flushed, centuries before the Romans made plumbing fashionable. At the heart of it all sits the so-called throne room, named for a carved alabaster chair flanked by stone benches. On the walls, griffins, the mythical protectors, stand watch. Was this the seat of a priest-king? A goddess's chamber? A divine court? No one knows. The answers lie beyond history's reach. But the walls still speak. They speak in color. Bright frescoes show dolphins gliding above bathtubs, women in flounced skirts and bare chests, young athletes vaulting over bulls in midair. This wasn't ornamental, it was identity. The Minoan worldview flowed through every brushstroke, fluid, elegant, utterly in tune with land and sea. And still, the deeper you go, the more the place begins to bend your sense of self. It's as though it was designed to bewilder. Not trap, but enchant. Maybe that's the true origin of the labyrinth, not a dungeon for monsters, but a sacred maze meant to inspire awe, mystery, and a little fear. There are no iron gates here. No roaring beasts. Just silence, and the question, what lies just around the corner? Knossos wasn't just a seat of power, it was a sanctuary. A temple in disguise. An architectural expression of the Minoan spirit, steeped in ritual, mystery, and myth. Unlike later Greek temples with towering columns and shrines of marble, Knossos wore its sacredness like a secret. It didn't declare, it whispered. Shrines nestle in corners. Columns rise like ancient sentinels. Horns, carved, curved, symbolic, appear on altars and rooftops. The bull is everywhere, not as a threat, but as a sacred companion. The Minoans did not seem to fear the bull. They revered it. They danced with it. They built their world around it. The bull-leaping fresco at Knossos is more than just ancient athleticism. It may represent a sacred rite. Young men and women, midair, soaring over a charging bull. Not for sport, but for the gods. A ritual of danger and grace, of trust and transcendence. This was sacred theater. A symbolic triumph over chaos, performed in front of powers mortal eyes could not see. Then there are the snake goddesses. Found deep within palace storerooms, they remain among the most iconic Minoan artifacts. Bare-chested, arms lifted, serpents coiled around wrists and waists. These were not submissive idols. They were protectors. Of the home. Of the womb. Perhaps even of the soul. To the Minoans, the snake was more than a creature. It was a symbol of rebirth, of mystery. Slithering between earth and underworld. A quiet conduit to divine realms. The rooms where these goddesses were discovered hint at domestic shrines. Sacred alcoves tucked away within the palace's busy heart. And when taken with the bull-leapers, the stylized horns, the labyrinthine halls, the palace begins to feel like something else entirely. A machine of ritual. A structure not just for rule, but for communion with the divine. There is no single grand temple at Knossos. Because the palace was the temple. Its architecture, its art, its winding corridors. They weren't secular. They were spiritual. This was a place where walls held meaning, where doorways whispered myth, where every echo in every stone hall may once have been a prayer. Knossos didn't merely shelter people. It sheltered gods. For centuries, the palace stood as a beacon of innovation, beauty, and mystery. But then, something happened. Sudden, uncertain, and still unsolved. By around 1400 BC, Knossos was abandoned. The frescoes faded. The hearths went cold. And the Minoan civilization, once the master of the Mediterranean, slipped into the sea mist of history. What happened? Some point to nature. Around 1600 BC, the volcanic island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, erupted. One of the most powerful eruptions in human history. The blast sent tsunamis crashing against Crete's northern coast. It drowned ports, scorched fields, and unleashed ash that may have darkened skies, choked crops, and shattered the Minoan economy and spirit. Knossos survived the eruption, but perhaps not the aftermath. Others looked to war. By 1450 BC, the Mycenaeans, the mainland Greeks, had risen. They may have seen their chance in Crete's moment of weakness. Evidence shows Knossos was reoccupied. But the culture had changed. The art grew more militaristic. The language shifted from Minoan Linear A to Mycenaean Linear B. Snake goddesses and sea frescoes gave way to harder, colder expressions of rule. Knossos still stood. But it no longer spoke the same tongue. Some believe the Mycenaeans didn't conquer with blades, but with trade, with marriages, with influence. Others believe Crete collapsed from within. Civil unrest, elite failure, political rot. And here is what's most haunting. There are no signs of mass death. No walls blackened by flame. No bodies scattered in desperation. Knossos didn't fall with a roar. It fell with a sigh. The great palatial engine simply stopped. The rooms grew silent. The rituals ended. And nature returned root by root, stone by stone. By the time Homer sang of Crete in his epics, Knossos was already a legend. A myth wrapped in monsters, kings, and labyrinths. And perhaps that's how it should be. Because what ended Knossos wasn't just eruption or invasion. It was time. And time, even more than war, buries empires. But the bones remain. And if you listen closely, the maze still hums beneath the earth. For thousands of years, Knossos slumbered beneath the sun-baked soil of Crete. Just another forgotten hill cloaked in olive trees and silence. Its name erased, its stories reduced to rumor, its walls hidden under centuries of dust. Until one man decided to follow the whisper of a myth. That man was Sir Arthur Evans. A British archaeologist with a flair for drama and a lifelong passion for Homeric epics. Evans didn't merely uncover Knossos, he reimagined it. In the year 1900 he bought the land from local farmers who'd been unearthing strange seals and fragments hinting that something massive lay buried beneath their fields. Evans began to dig. And what he found would reshape the story of the ancient Aegean. He uncovered a palace so intricate, so ambitious in its design, that he became convinced this was the fabled home of King Minos. The strange architecture, the painted horns, the labyrinthine layout, it all seemed to him to confirm the legend. The labyrinth was real, and he had found it. But Evans was more than an archaeologist. He was a mythmaker. He named the people of Knossos the Minoans, after the mythic king. He studied their art, translated their symbols, and in some places, rebuilt the ruins, using reinforced concrete to restore portions of the palace. Some called him a visionary. Others called him a vandal. Because what you see today at Knossos is part ancient wonder, part Edwardian imagination. Still, no one can deny this. Evans brought Knossos back to life. He unveiled a world older than Athens, more mysterious than Sparta. A Bronze Age civilization that pulsed with beauty, seafaring power, and sacred ritual. He also uncovered one of archaeology's greatest puzzles, Linear A written script still undeciphered today. Its symbols are silent. But they hint at a language, a people, and a complexity we're only beginning to grasp. Evans didn't just uncover ruins. He unearthed a story. One that forced us to consider that behind the myth of the Minotaur was something achingly real, a palace that confounded the senses, a people lost to time, and a legend made of stone. Knossos had slept for over 3 millennia. Evans was the one who woke it. To walk through Knossos is to enter a language made not of words, but of symbols. Frescoes, carvings, geometry, they cover every surface. But the Minoans left no Rosetta Stone. Their primary script, Linear A, remains a mystery. So instead of reading their voices, we must interpret their art, painted across wet plaster, etched into columns, hidden in repeating forms. What were they trying to tell us? The art of Knossos is unlike anything from the ancient Mediterranean. You don't find warriors in bronze or endless rows of kings. You find life. Dolphins dancing above tubs. Blooming lilies twisting up walls. Birds mid-flight. Sacred bulls charging across mythic fields. And the humans, they're lithe, elegant, caught in movement, often engaged in dances or rites. Even in depictions of danger there's grace. The Minoans weren't documenting conquest. They were celebrating existence, its rhythms, its beauty, its balance with nature. And at the heart of their visual language is one haunting symbol, the double axe, or labris. Found throughout the palace, in shrines, on frescoes, and carved into stone, it likely held deep religious meaning. Some believe it represented a goddess. Others say it symbolized the moon, or cosmic balance. Still others suggest the word, labyrinth, may come from this very symbol, making the labyrinth not a place of imprisonment, but a sanctuary of the double axe. A sacred space. Not a trap. Then there are the horns of consecration. Stylized bull horns placed atop walls, entrances, and altars. These were no mere decoration. They marked boundaries between the divine and the mundane. Combined with the many depictions of bull leaping, it's clear, the bull was not just an animal to the Minoans. It was a symbol of immense spiritual weight. The bull is everywhere. Even the layout of Knossos may have meant more than function. Some archaeologists believe it wasn't just built to house rulers or rituals. It was designed to echo the heavens. The palace's winding corridors and nested rooms may have mirrored celestial cycles, seasonal changes, a walkable cosmos. It wasn't a prison. It was a spiritual labyrinth, a journey through life, through death, through something deeper than both. But without a deciphered script, we tread the line between discovery and dream. The Minoans spoke in images, not epics. Symbols, not scrolls. So we interpret. What is Knossos trying to tell us? We feel its rhythms. We see its forms. But the meaning always seems to vanish just before we touch it, like a thread slipping back into myth. Yes, Knossos is a ruin. But it doesn't feel dead. Walk through its echoing halls, and you'll feel something stirring beneath the stone. Not ghosts. Not gods. But echoes. Of lives once lived. Of questions that never faded. Thousands of years after its fall, Knossos still holds us in its maze. Tourists trace its paths. Archaeologists dig for answers. Writers craft new legends in its shadow. The Minotaur may be a myth. But the labyrinth? It's real. We don't know the names of the kings who ruled here. We don't know the voices of the priests, the prayers of the people. But we know what they loved: beauty, balance, the natural world. They built not just walls, but wonders, where architecture was art, and art was worship. And they were the first. Before the Parthenon, before the temples of Jerusalem or Persepolis, there was Knossos. A palace that was also a city. A city that was also a temple. A temple that might also have been a story. Because maybe the labyrinth wasn't just a trap. Maybe it was a narrative. A myth carved into stone. The legend of the Minotaur didn't arise from nothing. It came from here, from the palace's twisting corridors, from the sacred power of bulls, from the awe it inspired in every generation that tried to explain it. The Greeks told a story. We built a science. But at its heart, Knossos was always both. Today, we can stroll through its ruins in broad daylight. We can snap photos, chart floor plans, restore its frescoes. But the mystery still lingers. That shimmering boundary between fact and legend still dances in the heat over its ancient stones. Maybe that's why Knossos endures, because it doesn't give us all the answers. It reminds us that some histories aren't puzzles to solve, they're sensations to feel. And Knossos, ancient, entangled, half-remembered, isn't just a dot on a map. It's a question. One that draws us deeper with every step. And like Theseus, we are all still following the thread. Now shift. From myth to metal. From sacred corridors to siege engines. Ancient engineers knew exactly what they were doing. The earliest battering rams were simple and brutal. A tree trunk lifted by soldiers and slammed into gates. Less army, more frenzied lumberjacks with a mission. But over time, the ram evolved. Engineers learned to mount it inside a wheeled frame. At a roof, suddenly your crew is safe from arrows, stones, and boiling oil. And what once was a tool became a weapon of fear. The Assyrians turned rams into psychological warfare. Their siege towers weren't just machines, they were mobile nightmares. Archer platforms rained death while the rams shattered city gates. Reliefs from ancient Nineveh show them clearly, giant beasts of timber, tipped in iron, rolling forward like gods of ruin. And they didn't just go for the front door. Rams were aimed at weak spots, watchtowers, wall joints, gatehouses. When a ram appeared, the message was clear: surrender, or watch your world collapse like old bread. The Greeks refined them. The Romans perfected them. And somewhere between the bronze thunder of siege and the silent echo of ancient halls, we are reminded that history is never one story. It is many, interwoven, echoing, unending. Roman engineers created colossal siege rams known as Ares, named after the Latin word for ram. These massive beams, suspended by chains or ropes inside towering shelters, were feats of force and coordination. Some were so enormous they required dozens of men working in perfect unison to operate. And when the beam began to swing, the sound was said to echo like thunder rippling across stone walls. But as brutal as they were, battering rams weren't mindless weapons. They demanded coordination, timing, and nerves of steel. Operators had to keep the beam moving rhythmically while shielding themselves from boiling pitch, flaming arrows, and every grotesque concoction defenders could hurl from above. A stalled ram was a sitting duck, a monument to failure. Yet once a ram gained momentum, truly thundered into motion, almost nothing could stand against it. It was the raw physics of war, wood versus stone, force versus endurance. It was the opening act of a long, merciless performance. But if the ram was the muscle, the catapult was the mind. While rams battered the gates at arm's length, catapults struck from afar, raining down devastation, chaos, and something worse, fear. They were the first true instruments of artillery, revolutionizing siege warfare by harnessing kinetic energy in ways that must have seemed like sorcery to those on the receiving end. The earliest catapults emerged in the Greek world during the 4th century BC. Their creation was the work of restless innovators who sought to combine mechanical ingenuity with military might. Among them was Dionysius I of Syracuse, a tyrant with a flair for innovation and a thirst for domination. He commissioned a new breed of weapon, torsion-powered catapults that used bundles of twisted sinew or hair to store energy. These weren't just oversized slings. They were finely tuned machines of terror. Their genius lay in precision mechanics. Engineers realized that twisting cords of sinew or animal hair created immense potential energy. Release that tension, and you could hurl massive projectiles, stones, spears, or flaming payloads, hundreds of meters. Two primary types emerged: the ballista, which fired giant bolts like an enormous crossbow, and the stone-throwing catapult, which hurled boulders with thunderous impact. Then the Romans arrived, and as always, took what the Greeks invented and made it better. Roman engineers built catapults that could be broken down into parts, loaded onto carts, and reassembled in the field. These were siege engines made for mobility and scale. Some Roman models could launch 60-pound stones at lethal speed, capable of punching through wooden palisades, fortress walls, and unlucky defenders alike. But these machines weren't just about destruction. They were theatrical. A message cast in stone. Generals used them to instill dread. Corpses were flung over battlements to spread disease and despair. Severed heads were lobbed into city squares to break morale. In one chilling account, diseased carcasses were catapulted into enemy strongholds, an early experiment in biological warfare. Yet catapults were not without limitations. They were heavy, complex, and sensitive to uneven terrain. A single slope could compromise an entire setup. But when positioned correctly, and operated with precision, they could bring cities to their knees, without ever breaching the gate. For the first time in military history, high stone walls no longer guaranteed safety. Because now, death came from above. The sky had become a battlefield. And if catapults were cunning, the trebuchet was divine. Towering like a moving cathedral, creaking with dread and elegance, the trebuchet wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of inevitability. The undisputed monarch of medieval siegecraft, it didn't whisper threats. It roared them. When a trebuchet rolled onto the battlefield, it wasn't just an engine of war. It was a declaration. A thunderous message carved in wood and stone. Your walls will not save you. Unlike the twisted cords of catapults, or the stored tension of torsion weapons, the trebuchet relied on gravity. A simple principle, exquisitely executed. A long wooden arm, balanced on a sturdy frame, with a massive counterweight at one end and a sling at the other. Raise the weight, release it, and the arm would swing violently, launching the sling high into the air, casting destruction in a graceful, deadly arc. It was elegant violence. Precise. Predictable. Devastating. Its origins lie in ancient China, where early versions, called traction trebuchets, were powered by teams of soldiers pulling ropes instead of using counterweights. But it wasn't until the 12th century that the counterweight trebuchet was born, likely passed through Byzantine or Islamic engineers, before transforming the battlefields of Europe and the Crusades. Once it arrived, it spread like wildfire. A weapon of power, prestige, and fear. The numbers are staggering. A well-built trebuchet could hurl 300-pound stones over 300 meters. Projectiles the size of furniture smashed into battlements, toppled towers, and pulverized morale. But its real genius was in its trajectory. Unlike the flat, blunt force of a catapult, the trebuchet delivered destruction over the wall, striking courtyards, barracks, supply lines hidden behind defenses. And it wasn't just rocks. These machines launched everything. rotting animal carcasses to spread disease, burning pitch, lime to blind defenders. Even notes wrapped around stones, taunts, threats, or crude messages sent with a crash. One legendary tale tells of Werewolf, the most fearsome trebuchet ever built, assembled during the siege of Stirling Castle in Scotland. The defenders surrendered at the very sight of it. But the king? He refused their surrender, just so he could see Werewolf fire. And yet, for all its terror, the trebuchet was not a fast weapon. It took hours to construct, minutes to reload, and required the skill of trained engineers. Still, no other siege weapon matched its combination of power, precision, and psychological horror. It was like watching a thunderstorm form in slow motion, and knowing the lightning would fall exactly where it was aimed. When the counterweight dropped, entire cities held their breath, while catapults struck from afar, and battering rams smashed gates. Siege towers offered something more personal. They rolled straight to the walls and unleashed men. Picture it: a towering wooden structure, several stories tall, armored in wet hides to resist fire, bristling with archers, spearmen, and death. A mobile fortress and a battlefield elevator in one. When you saw one rolling toward your walls, you knew the siege was no longer theoretical. The battle had arrived at your doorstep. Siege towers weren't subtle. They were massive, terrifying, and brilliantly effective. The Assyrians were among the first to use them. But the Greeks and their successors took the design to theatrical extremes. During the siege of Rhodes in 305 BC, the Macedonian general Demetrius built something almost mythical. A 9-story siege tower known as the Helepolis, the taker of cities. It stood over 100 feet tall, clad in iron plates, armed with catapults on every level, and pushed forward by thousands of men. It was more than a weapon. It was a moving city, a monument to ambition. It also collapsed under its own weight. But even in failure, the vision was unmatched. The logic behind siege towers was brutally simple. Walls only work if no one can get over them. Enter the siege tower, a colossal, mobile fortress designed to neutralize that height advantage. These towering machines allowed soldiers to ascend and descend directly onto enemy battlements, bypassing gates, moats, and ladders altogether. From the top platforms, archers rained arrows like hail upon the defenders, while warriors on the lower decks prepared for the final charge. But these giants were far from invincible. They crept forward like lumbering beasts, slow and vulnerable. Mud could bog them down. Fire could devour them. Sabotaged ground could tip them. Defenders had countless ways to strike back: flaming arrows, massive stones, even to rain traps like hidden ditches or flooded moats. And then there were the clever countermeasures: secondary inner walls and steep banks that turned every step of a tower's advance into a trial. Still, when a siege tower made it to the wall, the effect was electric. A breach in stone was bad enough, but a wave of enemy soldiers spilling directly onto your ramparts, that was chaos incarnate. Siege towers turned battles into vertical mazes of survival. They made height both an asset and a liability. And once the drawbridge dropped, there was no retreat, only a descent into brutal hand-to-hand hell. But while giants marched above ground, some of the deadliest warfare happened in silence, far below the earth. Siege tunneling, also known as sapping, was a method as terrifying as it was ingenious. It worked not by attacking the wall, but by taking away the ground beneath it. The strategy was ancient, slow, and brutally effective. Dig under the wall, hold it up with wooden supports, then set those supports on fire. When the flames did their work, the tunnel collapsed, and the wall came tumbling down. One moment your city stood proud. The next, a section of it caved in like a rotted tooth. At the siege of Plataea in 429 BC, the Spartans tried to dig their way under the city walls, only for the defenders to counterdig. The result? Subterranean knife fights in the dark. Dirt showers, torches flaring, blades flashing in tunnels barely wide enough to crawl through. This tactic became known as countermining, and it added a horrifying layer to siege warfare. Imagine the scene: pitch-black tunnels, muffled breathing, and soldiers straining to hear the faint tap of an enemy's pickaxe. When they heard it, they dug toward it, fast, leading to cramped, suffocating battles fought with shovels, daggers, and desperation. There was no glory. Only choking dust, flickering shadows, and the constant threat of the earth itself turning against you. Yet when sapping worked, it worked spectacularly. One of the most notorious examples came in 1212 during the siege of Rochester Castle in England. King John's forces dug beneath the southern wall, packed the tunnel with pig fat, and lit the fire. The supports collapsed, and the entire tower above them fell in a roar of stone and smoke. The defenders, stunned and disoriented, surrendered shortly after. By the 13th century, siege engineers had become masters of the underground. They could read soil like scholars, measure pressure points, and plan collapses with surgical precision. These were not just soldiers. They were geologists, demolitionists, and madmen rolled into one. Tunneling took time, effort, and a touch of madness, but it proved one chilling truth: if you couldn't scale a wall, and you couldn't break through it, you could still bring it crashing down from beneath. And not all the terror came from the siege engines themselves. For every battering ram built, every catapult fired, every tower advanced, the defenders had their own arsenal of horrors. And some of them burned. Let's begin with the most terrifying of all: Greek fire. Greek fire. Born from the ingenuity of the Byzantine Empire in the 7th century CE, it wasn't just a weapon, it was alchemy turned apocalypse. A burning substance, sticky and wild, that clung to sails, armor, and skin. And somehow, impossibly, it burned on water. Launched from siphons or sealed inside ceramic pots hurled like grenades, it erupted into chaos. Naval battles became floating infernos. Wooden hulls went up in flames, and flesh blistered as sailors leapt screaming into seas that offered no escape. To this day, no one knows exactly what it was made of. The recipe died with the empire that guarded it like gold. But the terror it left behind? That survived. If high-tech horror wasn't available, defenders had their own brutal classics. Boiling water. Scalding oil. Even sand, heated until it flowed like molten glass, poured down through murder holes onto the unlucky invaders below. These weren't just defensive tactics. They were rituals of agony. Oil, in particular, was feared. It soaked into cloth, slipped beneath armor, clung to flesh, then turned to flame. Climbing a siege ladder wasn't just dangerous. It was a ticket to a death by fire that wouldn't go out. And then there was the sand. Not as flashy, but far crueler. Heated and poured down from above, it slithered into the seams of armor, at the neck, the elbows, the wrists, cooking the skin underneath with slow, meticulous fury. It didn't roar like fire. It whispered. But it left behind just as many screams. But gravity was the oldest ally of all. Stones, logs, barrels filled with rocks, or worse, corpses, came crashing down from the parapets, flattening siege engines and splintering ranks. The goal wasn't just to kill. It was to shatter morale, to break the spirit before the wall even cracked. Castles became puzzles made of traps, collapsing floors, hidden spikes, dead ends disguised as rescue. The entire fortress transformed into a riddle that answered every guess with pain. All of it, every flame, every boiling drop, served a single goal: delay. Every hour the walls held was another hour the enemy starved. Another day closer to reinforcements. Another sunrise that spread sickness through crowded siege camps. In the end, siege warfare was a battle of time. And while the attackers had brute force, the defenders had fire and imagination. But destruction was only half the war. The other half was psychological. Siege weapons weren't just devices of ruin. They were symbols, titanic, flaming omens of death. Every groaning wheel of a siege tower, every whistling stone hurled by a trebuchet wasn't just an attack, it was a message: you are not safe. Commanders knew this well. The Assyrians dragged their siege engines across entire deserts with trumpet parades and military processions, letting the enemy see what was coming. The Romans built their siege camps right within view of the city they would crush, making sure defenders watched as catapults were tested, rams were sharpened, and doom was constructed plank by plank. Siege was theater. And fear? That was part of the performance. Sometimes the missiles themselves told stories. Severed heads of messengers. The dismembered limbs of fallen officers. Entire corpses, launched over walls still clad in armor. Psychological warfare written in blood. During the siege of Constantinople, the Byzantines faced not just stones, but disease. Corpses hurled over walls. Bodies riddled with plague, used not just to kill, but to infect. In 1346, at the siege of Kaffa, the Mongols are believed to have launched plague-ridden bodies into the city. Some historians believe that moment helped spark the Black Death in Europe. One siege, one trebuchet, millions dead. The trebuchet wasn't merely a weapon. It was an announcement. You didn't just see it, you heard it first. The groan of wood under tension. The grinding pull of ropes. And then, that sound. The thunk of the counterweight dropping like a judge's gavel. It was the heartbeat of a siege. A reminder that death was not just coming. It was already airborne. And what came next? You never knew. Would it be a boulder? A pot of pitch? A barrel filled with flame, or disease, or nothing at all? Or maybe, worse than all of them, silence. Because in siege warfare, the quiet was never peace. It was just the breath between destruction. A heavy, ominous silence settled over the battlefield as engineers steadied their aim. Even the absence of sound became a weapon. The rhythmic pounding of a battering ram, the creak of drawn ropes, or worse, an abrupt, eerie quiet just before impact, could fray the nerves of even the most seasoned defenders. Anticipation became agony. For commanders, this wasn't just about destroying walls, it was about dismantling hope. They wanted defenders to believe resistance was futile, that their gods had abandoned them, that the fortress standing proud yesterday was just dust in the making. When that psychological dam finally shattered, gates didn't always need to be broken. Sometimes they were simply opened from within. Because in siege warfare, the mind often fell before the stone. Then came the Age of Thunder. As gunpowder roared into the late medieval battlefield, the towering engines of old began to fade. But their influence didn't die, it transformed. The invention of the cannon rewrote the rules. What once took a trebuchet hours of thundering momentum, a single cannonball could now accomplish in seconds. Stone walls that had stood for centuries were suddenly weaknesses, not strengths. By the 15th century, Europe's great castles, once invincible symbols of power, were crumbling under the iron fury of cannon fire. Walls collapsed, not from sappers or fire arrows, but from explosive force that tore through battlements like parchment. A new era of siege warfare had dawned, louder, deadlier, and faster. Yet even as the cannon rose, the wisdom of ancient siege engineers endured. Today's precision artillery, guided missiles, and ballistic systems still trace their lineage to the same fundamental challenge. How do you destroy what was built to endure, from afar? Modern physics, trajectory mapping, kinetic force, All of it owes a debt to the sling stones and torsion springs of old. Even military psychology, shock and awe, saturation, bombardment, overwhelming presence, has roots in those early tactics. A trebuchet flinging a 200-pound stone into a city square wasn't just a tactical strike. It was a message. Those siege towers rolling across open plains, banners snapping in the wind, weren't just about access. They were about fear. About spectacle. About watching the courage drain from a city's walls before the soldiers even arrived. Their echoes still remain. At Masada, where Roman siege ramps scar the desert slopes. At Constantinople, where layered fortifications defied centuries of invaders, until cannon fire shattered the walls of a 1,000-year empire. At medieval castles across Europe, where rounded towers and angled bastions tell the story of a world forced to redesign itself, again and again, to survive the next siege. And today? Siege warfare hasn't disappeared. It's just changed its form. Cities are still surrounded, but now by blockades, digital firewalls, or information blackouts. Power grids fall. Communication lines are severed. Panic spreads not through catapults, but through screens. The battlefield has shifted, but the soul of the siege is unchanged. Someone wants in. Someone else wants to keep them out. Both are willing to wait, build, and break. The battering rams may have vanished. The trebuchets now rest in museums. But the spirit of siege warfare, the patient, methodical crushing of resistance, is very much alive. And it still knows how to win.